Tonight, the government says it's not going to escalate to trade war with the US, despite tariffs threatening the Chancellor's plans. Rachel Reeves has been warned by experts that Britain faces a disaster decade for living standards and a big risk of more tax rises in the autumn. New car tariffs announced by Trump have thrown the industry into turmoil and led to fears they could affect UK growth. We're due to hear from the US President this hour. Also tonight, Keir Starmer announces British military chiefs will go to Ukraine as he says Putin must be given a deadline to agree a ceasefire. Plus, an unusual protest in Australia's Parliament. Yes, that is a fish. We'll also be hearing about Nigel Farage's sweary lunch with journalists here in Westminster earlier. All that and more with Baroness Ayesha Hazarika and Rupert Harrison, who'll be with us for the next hour. We're not expecting any potty language from either. It's Thursday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. If there's one thing we've learned about Rachel Reeves this week, it's this. She is not a rule breaker. Her priority, perhaps above all else, is sticking to her fiscal rules to show Labour can be trusted with the public finances. But she hasn't made that easy for herself. At the budget last autumn, she only left herself £9.93 billion headroom or leeway, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not. And that headroom was predictably wiped out, which meant she had to make some pretty tough choices on benefits to claw it back. But what's to say it won't be wiped out again?
As she observed time and again, we live in a risky and changing world, as President Trump's actions overnight on tariffs demonstrates all too well. There's a good chance, then, that economic and fiscal forecasts will deteriorate significantly between now and an autumn budget. If so, she will need to come back for more, which will likely mean raising taxes even further.
It's worth seeing how the line's changed on tax rises. After the autumn budget, Rachel Reeves said, we're not coming back with more tax increases. But now that line has changed. They're saying they can't write future budgets. It might be that the tax-raising budget described as a once-in-a-parliament event could become more of an annual affair. Well, the dust has been settling after yesterday's spring statement. We can hear now from our economics and data editor, Ed Conway.
Usually the day after any fiscal event, you're talking still about that fiscal event. But here, the story is flipped back to this overarching issue. Tariffs, Donald Trump, what's going on there? And the Office of Budget Responsibility, in that update on the state of the economy, they did give a sense of what the impact of a trade war might be for the UK. This is their growth forecast that we've just heard about. Have a look at how it changes in the event of a trade war. So if everyone is imposing tariffs on everyone else, these bars are basically halved. So economic growth is essentially halved. It is much smaller than the expectations right now, and you've got higher inflation as well as that, and the impact on public finances. That headroom goes away. And right now we're learning more about what Donald Trump wants to do next. So this comes back to cars, OK? And this is a chart that he really does not like. It shows you US car exports over the years, going back to the 1960s, and imports. And the key thing here is that import line is far higher than the export line. And the difference between them, well, that is the trade deficit. The US sucking in more goods from overseas. And in the case of cars, it's rather a lot, which is why he's raising those tariffs. But that raises a question. How high are they going? At the moment, there's different categories here. At the moment, it's 2.5%. That's what's known as the most favoured nation tariff rate on cars. So on top of that, you're going to see an extra 25%, taking it really to quite a high level. But it's more than that, because it's not just the cars, it's also the components inside those cars that are going to be charged as well. That's going to be fiendishly complicated, but another 25% potentially goes on them. Then you've got light trucks. They are already charged at 25%. That goes back to the 1960s. It's called the chicken tax. The US basically didn't like the fact that Europeans didn't want to take their chickens, and they imposed a tariff on light trucks. Well, on top of that, you're going to have this extra 25%, so it mounts up. But God forbid, if you're making EVs in China, electric vehicles, look at this. So already you have 100% tariffs from Joe Biden, from the Joe Biden era. On top of that, there's another 20% that Donald Trump has imposed on all Chinese imports. You've got another 25% on any country that's importing oil from Venezuela. And then finally, that 25% that we've just heard about from Donald Trump, tot it all up, and you're talking about over 170% tariffs. It's extraordinary, really. Light trucks, 50%, and then components in cars at 27.5%, which doesn't sound like much anymore, but It is a lot. It is a lot. And it's going to be a big impact for all those countries sending cars to the US. And on this, Mexico, Japan right at the top. But look, the UK is actually the 6th biggest exporter of cars into the US. But despite these tariffs, Rachel Reeves says she won't retaliate.
We're not at the moment in a position where we want to do anything to escalate these trade wars. Trade wars are no good for anyone. It will end up with higher prices for consumers, pushing up inflation after we've worked so hard to get a grip of inflation. And at the same time, will make it harder for British companies to export.
The Chancellor there. The US is actually the single biggest destination for UK car makers, meaning this is likely to have a big impact in the UK economy quite soon.
Ed Conway there. Well, we've also seen another potential blow to the government earlier, with Sky News revealing British Steel has announced plans to close its 2 blast furnaces in Scunthorpe. Tonight, more than 2,000 jobs are at risk. Here's our North of England correspondent, Caterina Vitozzi.
Scunthorpe has had steel in its bones for more than 100 years.
The largest and greatest steel plant in the Commonwealth started from 2 small furnaces built here.
Thousands of jobs depend on the operation of these blast furnaces. Jobs today, workers learnt, may no longer exist in a matter of months.
Extremely shocking, because up until now I thought there was an opportunity where we presented a multi-union plan. That plan transitioned everybody. It cost a lot of money. There's no denying. It would have meant a significant investment from the government, match funded by Xingyi, and we thought they would look at that, but that's not been the case.
British Steel is the UK's last remaining producer of virgin steel, a high-grade, pure steel that's carbon-intensive to make. The UK government has been in talks with the company's Chinese owner, Xingyi, about moving to greener steel production, offering a taxpayer-funded £500 million to support the transition and keep this plant's blast furnaces open in the meantime. That deal now in tatters.
We haven't got an agreement as it stands, but it is a very, very challenging situation. I mean, both in terms of, it's not just about the level of resource, and I've got to make sure there's the right deal for the taxpayer as part of that. Obviously I need to know that there's a viable business being created at the end of that. I need guarantees on jobs if I'm putting public money in.
Today's announcement by British Steel highlights the difficult road ahead for the future of UK steel production. On one hand, the UK government is trying to support industry to preserve jobs and secure UK steel production. On the other hand, it's trying to meet its ambitious net zero targets. British Steel says the government offer is not enough. It says new US-imposed tariffs and current market conditions make it impossible to keep these furnaces open. 2,500 jobs would go with them.
Throughout the town, it's going to have a massive impact. It obviously affects everybody, really. From every small business, including myself. But you don't know what's going to happen.
Pretty good, to be honest. Gutted for the young guys. Yeah, it's not good. Sad day, really, for Scunny.
If the government can't bring British Steel back to the negotiating table, it'll mean the abrupt end to the UK's virgin steel production, a technique invented here during the Industrial Revolution, leaving the UK the only G7 nation not to make its own. Caterina Vitozzi, Sky News, Scunthorpe.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, that is Pat McFadden. Thank you very much for being on the programme. It's good to have you here. The last time you were on Politics Hub, Donald Trump had just announced a whole bunch of reciprocal tariffs. I don't know if you remember, and you said at the time very sensibly, the most sensible thing to do with all of these announcements is to digest them, to see if they actually come to pass, and then decide what to do. And now we've had more announcements from the United States, 25% tariffs on imported cars, levies on steel and aluminium. So how should we react?
Look, it's a serious situation. We are an open trading economy. We don't want to be in a situation of mutual tariffs around the world. That places us in some ways in a different position from the United States, where international trade is less of a proportion of their economy. But with regard to the specifics of what's been announced in the last 24 hours or so, I still say that the sensible thing for us to do is to keep talking to the United States, not to immediately overreact to announcements. That doesn't mean we don't take this seriously. We do, but I still think that's the right response, and that is what we're doing.
It sounds like you're not really liking the idea of reciprocal tariffs on the US.
No, we don't, because I think that would be in a position which isn't good for either country. But of course, we have to reserve the right to respond if we have to do that. Now, we hope that's not the movie that we're in. And, you know, we would rather come to a different solution with the United States. But I think the best thing, and, you know, maybe one of the things we've learned in the last couple of months is that the best way for these discussions to take place is through what in Parliament we might call the usual channels.
In the spring statement yesterday, and in a lot of the interviews around it, Rachel Reeves kept saying that the government's had to act because the world has changed. How has the world changed?
The international security position has obviously changed. We've been asked to step up in a very direct way on European security. That's part of the backdrop for the increase in defence expenditure that the government announced a couple of weeks ago. Just today, you've got the Prime Minister taking part in an important international meeting about Ukraine. That's changed a lot. I think you have to take the reaction to that change and also apply it to a degree to the domestic sphere. There are big long-term problems facing the country. When the world is changing, I think the leadership task is to understand it, respond to it, and explain it to the public. That's what we've been doing in recent weeks, and that's what we'll have to keep doing on a number of fronts.
You say the security situation has changed, but obviously the Ukraine war started several years ago. The thing that's changed is Donald Trump, isn't it, right?
Of course he's part of the change.
He is the change, isn't he?
He's not all the change, but that he's said that Europe needs to step up in its security. He's not the first US president to say this, but the question has definitely become sharper in recent weeks.
Well, Donald Trump is why the world has changed. Let's call a spade, right?
Well, he is one of the. You know, I'm not going to deny he's part of what's going on. It's had a big effect, but for us and for other countries, that will mean taking greater responsibility for our own security. We have to do that. It's a leadership task. It may be a cliche, but not all cliches are wrong, that the first duty of any government is to protect its people. We've responded to that new situation with the announcement we made, and you know, we will keep on responding to that change, including with European allies like today.
Yesterday, the government made some very painful decisions on particularly benefits, right, in order to try and balance the books, in order to try and maintain the same headroom, £9.93 billion against the Chancellor's fiscal rules. According to Oxford Economics, they say that the rising cost of government borrowing since the OBR locked in those assumptions have already halved that headroom. We've got tariff suggestions from Donald Trump today. I mean, it must feel like you're kind of walking in quicksand at the minute.
Well, it's not wise to react to short-term market movements, but I think if you look at the longer-term market situation, you can see why it was wise for the Chancellor to stick to her guns in terms of the economic stability position. There was a lot of speculation about what she'd have to do in the spring statement yesterday. Some of it wide of the mark, for example, on tax, and she didn't go down that road. And I think there was a test yesterday for the government, for the Chancellor. Would they stick to their guns despite this volatility in the international situation? And the answer was yes, we would. That was made clear from the Chancellor's statement. And I think that's been an important signal to those markets that you mentioned.
We talked a lot about the turbulence in the world, the changing world, the kind of quicksand of tariffs and security that it is putting pressure on that headroom. The headroom from last time was wiped out. According to Oxford Economics, the headroom this time has halved. You're going to have to raise taxes in the budget, aren't you?
Look, budgets are written by the other Chancellor, not by me. I think, honestly...
It's not what the papers say.
More seriously, to try to immediately fast forward 1 day after the spring statement to the budget in the autumn is unwise, precisely because it's a changing world.
Can I just come... Because that's the line, I get it, that you can't write the budgets now, right?
Not just a line, it's true.
But isn't part of the problem that this is a Labour government that has been resistant to being open about what you're planning? During the election campaign, you were saying, oh, it's all going to be fine, we can get growth on day one. You know, you ruled out tax rises in the 3 areas. You know, you said when people asked you about spending cuts, you didn't want to go there as well. Part of the problem that you're in now is because you haven't rolled the pitch, you haven't been honest with people. So I guess my question is, this is a chance to be honest with people, to be direct with people. Yes, the world has changed. If you want to stick to your fiscal rules, you're going to have to raise taxes, aren't you?
Look, it's not just a line. It's really important, partly because we do operate in a world where we have to send market signals. And that's why yesterday was an important test that the Chancellor passed and that the government passed. Now, with regard to the election and now, I don't think we ever said it was all going to be easy. And what we've done since the election...
But you weren't open about what you were going to do. And then that's why it was a shock for people when you came in and you did raise taxes.
We kept to the promise we made of not raising income tax, national insurance for employees or VAT. Because we kept to those promises and because we stabilised a very unstable situation when we took over, we have now got a better platform for the future, and you can already see some of the benefits of that. Money is going into public services. NHS waiting lists are down for 5 months in a row over the winter. We're going into a new financial year next week where pensions are going to go up, the minimum wage is going to go up, breakfast clubs are going to be rolled out. You're starting to see the change being implemented. But I acknowledge it's a difficult and volatile international situation.
Just finally, the Trump team accidentally added a journalist to a signal chat when they were discussing war plans. Are we reviewing our security arrangements with the US in light of that?
No, I don't believe we are, because the international partnership we have on security is protecting people in the UK every day. And I can't stress the importance of this in terms of the UK national interest. That relationship, that cooperation, that bond is really strong. It involves a lot of below-the-line cooperation, information sharing every day. And it's important that that continues. It's important that we are professional and serious about it, and we will be.
Have you ever been added to a chat by mistake?
I don't know. I have too much WhatsApp in my life, and I'd quite like to be taken off a few chats if I could.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, the latest economic turmoil will sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news, I should say, and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be Henry Hill and Kezia Dugdale. Right, let's bring in our duo for the evening, shall we? The Labour peer and broadcaster Baroness Hazarika and the economist Rupert Harrison, former Chief of Staff to George Osbourne. Great to have you both with us. You know, this is a classic fallout day from the spending review. That's what should be happening, the spring statement, I should say. But instead, we've got more bombshells coming from the US, more news, economic news from the UK with steel. I guess it just shows the kind of moving sands that we're having to grapple with. What's your take on where that leaves the Chancellor, Rupert?
Well, today's news really throws into kind of stark relief the risk that she took back in October and the risk she's taken again yesterday by leaving herself such a small amount of headroom against these fiscal rules that she's created sort of as such a kind of important arbiter of her success. And the risk is, like you were saying in that interview, if you know, it's very plausible that half of that headroom is already gone because interest rates have gone up. What surprises me is that she had an opportunity to get ahead of the curve, make that headroom bigger. But of course, that would have required very big, very difficult political decisions, particularly on tax. And so I think what we've seen is that she's squeezing everything that is kind of short of that, everything that she can get her hands on, welfare reforms and cuts to welfare benefits, squeezing departmental efficiency, getting everything she possibly can before she has to go to the really difficult choices.
Yeah, it does feel that, doesn't it? Because, there was broad consensus, and I say that very carefully because I know a lot of people were unhappy with it on international aid cuts, for example. Tax evasion is always a nice one to, get a little bit of money in the right aisle. But at some point, Ayesha, it does feel like Labour are going to have to come back with more tax rises, do you think?
Well, I mean, what I was sympathetic to what Pat McFadden was saying. Look, I understand the media speculation. With my journalist hat on, of course, we're like looking ahead already to the, let's start, speculating about the budget. But I think, and I say this objectively, it is so volatile at the moment. We literally do not know what was happening on a 24-hour to 24-hour basis, particularly because of what's coming out of the White House at the moment. And I think that the big takeaway for me, to be fair to me, I would say that.
We'll always be fair to you, don't worry.
I was thinking in the run-up to the election, and I know there was lots of, quite justified questions being asked, like, why is there not more kind of flesh on the bone? I was always so anxious about the geopolitics because it does feel that we have been buffeted. We've had difficult things happening in our own country, Liz Truss, Brexit, lots of things like that. But we have been at the mercy of so many things that are so beyond our control. And we are living in such capricious times at the moment. And I think, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, OK, you can do the knockabout stuff, and I get that. That's the the raw politics of the situation, and we can argue about some decisions that people may disagree that she's taken. But if you take a step back, I think for a lot of people, whether you're an economist, whether you're an ordinary citizen just watching this from home, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a politician, everything just feels very kind of precarious right now. It does not feel you could have the best nailed down. I don't think, by the way, there is a perfect counterfactual economic plan right now. I certainly haven't heard one. But I think everybody is just aware that you could have your idea of your best fiscal plan right now, and that could just be blown up by external events.
But look, you're totally right. But the job of politicians in that environment is to get some measure of control, get yourself into a situation where you do have choices and you're not just buffeted around. And that means getting on top of the public finances, giving yourself some headroom so you have the ability to react. And I think that means that it puts a premium. Back in October, I think it was the wrong decision. Now it's the wrong decision. If you're constantly living kind of budget to budget, living on the edge, you're not in a position of control. You're at the mercy of events.
What Labour would say is that they had more headroom than the Conservatives left them with after the election.
So that is true, and that is, I think, a classic kind of end of Parliament budget from Jeremy Hunt. Yeah. And that's, sadly, I think it was also very much a sort of fin de siècle, end of 14 years feeling it. If you go back to, I think the right comparison is 2010, so you had a new government, George Osborne's first budget, he gave himself 3 times more headroom. Right, and that's the beginning of a parliament where you want to be in control of events. Even that was then challenged because we had the Eurozone crisis and a lot of events. So this is not new that you have events, but you can put yourself into a position to have a bit more control.
But I think, look, I mean, obviously, there was a financial crash coming up to the 2010 general election. But if you look at that period of time from 2010, particularly when you've had, we've had a series of events from particularly, well, you could argue the sort of Scottish referendum, then you've got Brexit, then you're, into this kind of madness with the COVID, and then there have been a lot of external events. But look, what I would probably challenge on is I do think Labour has made some good long-term decisions. Like if you look at the planning reform, that is something which, the OBR has revised up some of the growth forecasts as a result of this. It's something which I'm sure many, and I know that many One Nation Conservatives, and even people on the right of the Conservative Party said, why did we not sort of tackle...
Absolutely.
I mean, that is a structural thing that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and Pat McFadden are right to pursue. So I think it's not fair to say that they're not doing anything that's the right thing.
We're nearly out of time on the chat, but there is one other question I was keen to ask, because Rachel Reeves, it seemed like this morning, was saying that there's not going to be any reciprocation to the Donald Trump tariffs. I felt like Pat McFadden opened the door a little bit more in that interview, although he said, we hope we're not in this movie, we think that'll be bad for both sides. He said that it is an option that we have to have on the table. How do you think we should be handling
he's got to keep his options open. I mean, it's interesting, you look around the world, there are different strategies from different countries about how to manage this Trump tariff threat. You've got some countries trying to play it tough, Canada and new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, is a great example of that. I'm not sure they've got politically any choice given the things that Donald Trump has said about Canada being the 51st state. But the UK is trying to play it nice. And I think at the moment that is the right strategy because we have some things to offer. There's some evidence that Trump maybe sees the UK a bit differently from the European Union. But, of course, that strategy, is only the right strategy if it's working. And so they've got to see, if they make concessions on things like the digital services tax, we levy a 10% tariff on American cars coming here. That, again, is a bargaining chip that you have. But if it's not working, then they might have to change strategy down the line. So he's right to keep his options open.
I mean, it's such a nightmare. It's so difficult because they're walking such a tightrope at the moment. And look, I mean, most sane people in the world still abide by the Reagan principle, which is protectionism does not lead to prosperity. And once you get into this kind of, tariff stuff, it's really, really difficult. So I think the government is, has to sort of, I've used this phrase before in your show, it feels like it's the kind of, we should all have T-shirts, hope for the best, but sort of prepare for the worst on this.
OK, thanks both very much indeed. Really interesting to get your perspective. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll cross to the US, where we are expecting to hear from President Trump at some point tonight after his announcement on car tariffs. And the UK and France to send defence chiefs to Ukraine as they set out plans to deploy a reassurance force when a peace deal is secured. We'll be live in Paris next. Plus, why one Australian senator pulled out, yes, a dead salmon in Parliament.
I'm James Matthews and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Is it a draw? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children? Great to see you. Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran? No. Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing. As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News. I want them to be treated equally like everyone else. It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
You're diminished by claims that you're a racist.
The question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Hello, welcome back. Well, given we've been talking so much about Donald Trump's tariffs and how they might affect the UK, I want to cross now to our US correspondent, David Blevins. David, thanks for being with us. The tariffs due to come in next Wednesday with the President branding it Liberation Day. Tell us more.
Yes, Liberation Day for tariffs, what he calls his favourite word, Sophie, something he's using to take back, in his own words, the soul of this nation. So he has all the right branding on the box, but I suppose it's rather difficult right now to know exactly what's inside the box. For two reasons: because his approach to tariffs is dizzying, quite frankly, because his target shifts from Canada to Mexico to China to the EU. It shifts from aluminium to timber to alcohol. We thought all of it had been put on hold until next week, what he calls Liberation Day, when he plans to roll out reciprocal tariffs on countries around the globe. But then yesterday came tariffs on cars. We know the impact that's going to have on the UK. There's talk of tariffs on pharmaceuticals. Perhaps today or tomorrow, that's going to have a massive impact across the Atlantic on Ireland, where nearly 50,000 people are employed by US pharmaceutical companies. The other thing that makes it very difficult to analyse is that it may not just be about the economy. Donald Trump says he wants to reduce the trade deficit and increase manufacturing. And tariffs may have done that in the past, but there's just as much evidence that it's American consumers who are going to pay the price this time. It may be just as much about his personality, because we know he's a businessman rather than a diplomat. He is retaliatory rather than conciliatory. And that's why it's really challenging for the UK government and for the EU right now to try and figure out how to prepare, because we're not quite sure when it's coming and what exactly is coming.
Yeah, that's exactly it, isn't it? It's definitely the feeling I'm getting from UK government ministers as well. David, thank you very much indeed. Now, Britain and France have agreed to send what they're calling a reassurance force to Ukraine to act as a security guarantee after any peace deal is agreed. European leaders have been meeting in Paris to discuss Russian sanctions, where Keir Starmer accused President Putin of playing games.
Now, President Trump has rightly called them out for dragging their feet. And we agreed here in Paris today that it's clear the Russians are filibustering. They are playing games, and they're playing for time. It is a classic from the Putin playbook. But we can't let them drag this out while they continue prosecuting their illegal invasion. Instead, we should be setting a framework and a deadline of delivering real progress. And then we should hold them to that deadline. So here in Paris, we've agreed that we must go further now to support the peace process, support Ukraine, and increase the pressure on Russia to get serious.
Well, we can speak now to our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, who's in Paris for us. Adam, what do you make of what's happened today?
I think it was a really interesting summit, but it's a little bit like the Arc de Triomphe roundabout behind me, which is there's lots of noise, lots of activity, but no one's actually quite sure what's happened and what's going on. It is that we had, about 30 countries here today. We had the big institutions, the European Union, Commission, we had NATO, Australia, Canada, Turkey, were all here. And they were all railing in behind the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, who was also in town, who got here yesterday. But to be honest, so far, Sophie, so very sort of predictable. We've had 3 years of European nations saying they are steadfastly behind Ukraine and that they will provide resources and they will provide diplomatic cover and political cover and so on and so forth. What has changed everything is what is going on in Washington, is the fact that European diplomats and politicians, I think, are struggling to get their heads around how to deal with Donald Trump and his administration. Why? Well, a few examples. Number one, we know a few days ago, senior figures in that administration referred to European leaders as pathetic and as freeloaders. I asked Keir Starmer about that, whether he could trust the administration, and he dodged the question entirely. Emmanuel Macron also dodging criticism of America. At the moment, Europe is a bit like someone who's being punched in the face but just doesn't want to fight back. They also are fearful of losing America's money being funneled into Ukraine, but tonight we're seeing more details of America's demands on Ukraine for this mineral deal, which looks, from a Ukrainian perspective, ever more difficult to sign up to. So I think there is a slow creeping realisation that Europe needs a plan B, something that it can enact even if America pulls out of the equation. And that will involve this expression, reassurance force, an expression that frankly nobody has ever used, as far as I'm aware, until about 3 days ago, and now is being used by diplomats all over this continent. But equally, Keir Starmer, when I was talking to him, said, yeah, but we're still going to need America involved in this. Well, what if they're not? There are so many questions that are still hanging in the air. There were a lot of good intentions today, a lot of support being expressed for Ukraine, money being promised to Ukraine. And we have these dozens of countries, this coalition of the willing. But the question, willing to do what? And at the moment, we don't seem to have a very clear answer.
Yeah, that really is the essay question, isn't it? What on earth is a reassurance force? Adam, thank you very much indeed. Adam Parsons against the very beautiful backdrop of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Well, we're joined now by the former NATO Deputy Secretary-General, Rose Gottemoeller. Thank you so much for being with us. We've been talking about this idea of a reassurance force in Ukraine provided by the UK and France the day after a peace deal is agreed. There has, of course, been concern that Russia could see any peacekeeping force as a provocation. Do you think that this reassurance force is a good idea?
Well, I think there are still a lot of things to be defined about it. Your correspondent was quite right about that. And furthermore, I thought Prime Minister Meloni of Italy had an important message today when she said the United States really needs to be in these meetings too. It really needs to be represented at these European meetings. And it will be only possible, I think, to have an effective reassurance force if the United States is ready to support it diplomatically and politically, and perhaps also support it with some key enabling capabilities, intelligence support, for example. So there are still many questions to be answered. I think it can work. Such forces have played a good role in the past during a peace process, but we still don't know enough, I would say, at this time as to whether peace will take shape at all.
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? It's all very well to talk about the day after a peace deal is signed. What's your assessment on how close any agreement could be?
I hear a Russian negotiator say, in principle, I am ready to agree, but then I know there'll be a big list of conditions coming afterwards. And I just took a close look at this so-called Black Sea deal that was agreed in the past week, and wow. The principles, the concessions that Putin is demanding in that Black Sea deal are considerable. They said, in principle, we agree to this, but, and here are the concessions we demand. They are the same old concessions they had during the Black Sea grain deal, that is to get the Agricultural Bank of Russia involved in the payment system again. It's under sanctions. But then they also said, and you must open up the SWIFT payment mechanism to Russia again. That is a gigantic concession that they are asking for. And to my mind, it just shows that they are indeed not very serious about making this peace deal happen. They are stringing Trump along, in my view. Vladimir Putin is stringing Trump along.
Wow, you think that Putin is stringing Trump along? Do you think Trump realises this? What do you think their relationship is?
Well, it's very interesting. The president is an astute businessman, as also mentioned just now on your program, and he is somebody accustomed to real estate negotiations. And he said exactly that today. He said, I can see when this is happening to me. I've done it myself in real estate negotiations when I don't really want to make a deal. So I think the time has probably come. He's probably realizing that when he needs to start turning the screws a bit on the Kremlin. We'll see if that happens or not. Up to this point, it's been more carrots for the Russians and more sticks to the Ukrainians. But they have spoken about, and President Trump himself has spoken about more sanctions on the Russians. So let's see if they can come to that.
I was going to ask about your assessment on Donald Trump and his view on Russia and on Europe, but in a way, I kind of feel that's kind of immovable. That is what it is. The key question is, how should Europe respond? What do you think the UK should be doing now?
Well, I've been admiring Keir Starmer's approach. His remarks just now, I think, really pointed to the way that he's saying now Europe must take responsibility for its own defense. It must be figuring out a way to work between the United States and Europe and among the Europeans and the United States to be an effective balancing force to Russia. And so I do think that that is the right approach overall. And indeed, President Zelensky seems to be ready now, too, to work ever more closely with the Europeans. And so in general, I think that Europe can be an effective participant in these negotiations, most importantly, because they hold the whip hand in terms of forgiveness of sanctions for the Russians. Washington's never going to be able to forgive all these sanctions all by itself. They have to be forgiven step by step upon Russian performance in resolving the situation with Ukraine and implementing a peace deal. But the Europeans have a very strong role in that process happening. And so Washington will have to work with Europe in order to gain sanctions relief on Russia when the time is right.
And just finally, you of course are a former NATO Deputy Secretary General. What are the odds that America leaves NATO during Trump's presidency?
0. Trump himself has said he is not planning to leave NATO. But the question is, how effectively will they participate in leadership in NATO? You know, the United States has always been first among equals at NATO, has always been a very strong participant in NATO. But now I foresee a stepping back from that role of leadership and letting others take the lead. I don't think in the end of the day that is fatal for the NATO alliance at all. It requires an evolution in how NATO has operated, always looking to the Americans for guidance. It's not going to be happening now. So Europe will itself and the Canadians have to work out new leadership arrangements. But I do not believe that the United States intends to withdraw from NATO. President Trump himself has said that. And Pete Hegseth, when he came to the first NATO ministerial, said, the United States supports NATO and European security, full stop. So I think we need to remember that as well.
It's been really fascinating to talk to you. I feel like I've learned an awful lot, so thank you for your time this evening.
You're welcome.
All right, let's bring in Ayesha and Rupert again, shall we? A reassurance force. Ayesha, what's your feeling on what was announced today?
Well, I very much agree with what your correspondent was saying. I think it's really important to keep up the momentum with all of this diplomatic activity. I think it's really important to kind of send the signals to the White House and to the wider world that the Europeans are coming together. I think that's really, really important. But there are lots of difficult questions that are not yet answered. I mean, first of all, you know, I read tonight that, you know, they're talking about UK sort of senior military people going over to Ukraine to start drafting a ceasefire. There is no ceasefire. You know, this is our optimism bias, and I understand we have to try and manifest it, but there is no ceasefire because Russia hasn't agreed to a ceasefire. And, you know, if there is some kind of, you know, force on the ground, what happens if they're fired at? And, you know, there's still lots of questions which are unanswered. We know that there's still really only 2 countries that have committed to putting boots on the ground. Poland has said no. Italy has said no. You know, people are making warm words, but no one's really signing on the line at the moment. So all of this is incredibly difficult. Plus, if you overlay the stuff we were talking about earlier in terms of the tariffs, you know, Keir Starmer's juggling so many plates at the moment. He's trying to get America into the right place in terms of Ukraine, probably as well on Gaza and Israel behind the scenes. We're also trying to make sure that they don't come at us with tariffs. All of this stuff is, you know, it's such a difficult thing. And the other thing which is so hard is the lead characters in all of this are 2 very unreliable people. You have Donald Trump, and at the top of the tree is President Putin. I mean, all of this stuff is so difficult.
Rupert?
I mean, I think it's an impressive effort, and I agree it's like the right thing to do, but it's slightly in a parallel world because the truth is the Europeans are not at the table. The discussion over Ukraine is happening between President Trump, President Putin, and occasionally President Zelensky. And, you know, the reality is that Putin, I think, is very unlikely to agree to anything that is going to involve any NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. So this is all at the moment a bit of a dance. And I think what's really going on is that Europe is desperate to try and impose itself into this process. And so by putting together this coalition of the willing and looking like we can be a sort of viable partner in this, they're trying to just get to the table, because at the
trying to
moment
get in the room.
we're not in the room. The Europeans are not in the room.
And the thing
and we are miles away from a ceasefire at the moment. You know, I think they're absolutely right that Putin is stringing things along. This could drag on and on and on.
And what's really difficult, I mean, in the kind of comedy, tragedy, farce of the whole signal debacle, the thing that should trouble us the most is a reveal into the actual mindset of the Americans when it comes to the Europeans. We're freeloaders. They clearly think very little of us, and I do still include us as being Europeans. We've left the EU, but, you know, it's really good that Keir Starmer is you know, reasserting Britain as a strong European leader. But that is troubling. You know, if anything, they're the glimpses, and we want to make sure that we're not being strung along as well, and that's really difficult.
Yeah. It's often said that we have to decide, if you like, if we should kind of tack to the US or we should tack to Europe. Well, what's your take on that?
Well, on defence, there has been a watershed moment. I think that the European members of NATO have realised that even if you get another president after Donald Trump, the possibility of the Americans not being there when you need them is now on the table. And so when it comes to defence capabilities, we have got to build something that is less reliant on the US. I think in terms of the diplomatic and economic strategy, it still is, I think, quite sensible. I think Keir Starmer is actually playing this pretty well. He's trying to cosy up to Donald Trump on the economics. He's trying to pose as a kind of leader alongside Emmanuel Macron as the two great military powers in Europe. He's doing that quite effectively. The problem is, you know, at what point are you going to get some results? Going back to the tariffs discussion, is he actually going to achieve anything for the UK? And is this kind of, you know, European willingness to provide a reassurance force going to come to anything? Because, as you said, they're not in the room. Yeah. So it's a good strategy for now, but at some point it's got to deliver some results.
Thanks both very much indeed, Ayesha and Rupert there. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Where one Australian senator pulled out a dead salmon in Parliament in an act of protest.
Hello, coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock. We'll take a look at how the latest Trump tariffs impact the British motor industry. Also ahead tonight, world-famous photographer Rankin brings school photo day to Great Ormond Street Hospital. And we'll hear from the actor Aryan Bakare after he is nominated for a TV BAFTA. All that and much more on the UK Tonight at 8.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power.
No freedom!
Sky News, the full story first. There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition. This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. Free wherever you get your news. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in. Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous. We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Premier League Run-In is live on NBC and Peacock as City Pride is on the line with a pair of iconic derbies.
It doesn't get any better.
April 3rd, it's a London derby. Chelsea. Spurs.
What a game!
April 6th.
Brace yourself, Manchester, for the mother of all derbies.
United. Running is live on NBC.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, it is not every day that a dead salmon makes its way into Parliament, but that is exactly what happened in Australia. The Green Party Senator Sarah Hanson-Young was protesting controversial new laws to protect Tasmania's salmon industry, which some argue will endanger native species. Her protest caused quite a stink, and look, just keep an eye on the man behind her.
WWF, Greenpeace, the Australia Institute, they've all condemned these laws. On the eve of the election, have you sold out your environment credentials for a rotten, stinking extinction salmon? Extinction salmon.
Senator Hanson-Young, remove the prop from the chamber. Senator Hanson-Young, you're not in a debate with me. It's a prop. It's a prop. Remove it from the chamber.
Now, I'll admit, it was just such a funny video. There's no real reason to play it. But it's just too good. It's too good. But there is a tenuous link because it turns out, by pure coincidence, salmon was on the menu at the Parliamentary press gallery lunch today. There you go. And there were also some pretty punchy remarks from Reform's leader, Nigel Farage, as well. Our very own John Craig, of course, was there. You don't miss many press gallery lunches, do you, John?
I had to miss one for a funeral earlier in the year, but it has to be something like a funeral for me to miss it. I've been going to those since the early 1980s. I mean, today, let me tell you what we had. Black treacle-cured salmon, it was very nice, and baked supreme of chicken with beetroot and dill dressing. I have to say, the catering has improved in Parliament over the years. I mean, Ayesha, of course, is down the posh end of Parliament, where the catering is even better than it is in the Commons.
It is nice. The
classy in the Lords.
Nice.
But, I mean, I've been going... These press gallery lunches, it was Nigel Farage was the speaker today, and they can make or break political careers. Sometimes you get a boring politician, you think, who turns out to be very good, and we, the journalists, all say, oh, he or she's actually pretty good. And sometimes somebody who you think's going to be good, bit flat. Anyway, Nigel Farage, as you can imagine, did not disappoint. Vaudeville act, lots of funny jokes. He was extremely rude about Conservative MPs. He called them a boring bunch of stuck-up old... word beginning with B, which we can't say on TV. And that's on the record, he said. He was very rude about Kemi Badenoch, saying how lazy she was. And then talking about why there aren't more women in Reform UK. I've spent my entire life trying to appeal to women. I've had the odd success here and there. I'm very pro-women. And then it was another funny remark was he talking about the Euros in Germany. The last big football tournament in Germany, we were telling young men, don't shout, don't sing songs, don't drink more than 2 pints of beer. He said, there's no point in going, really. So he was on good form. He also hit back, I should just mention, the NatWest Bank, as our colleague Mark Kleiman revealed yesterday that he's reached a settlement over this debanking row. And when I asked him about it today, he won't say how much money he's got in compensation, but he did say he blamed the woke virus, as he puts it, in big companies, corporate America, corporate and corporate UK.
Rupert, I have to say, your face throughout this. I can take you're not a fan of Nigel Farage.
Well, I think I will take the silence option on that one. But look, I totally agree that these press gallery lunches are like the politicians. He was probably quite nervous before it because the politicians are really nervous beforehand. I remember the prep that would go into like getting good jokes. Like the call would go out, I need good jokes because you can't flop one of these.
Is this from George Osbourne that you're remembering
absolutely.
that when you were prepping him for the press
absolutely.
gallery?
Because, if you fall flat on one of these, it's a very important audience.
Any good jokes you remember?
God, I mean,
I remember George
must have
Osbourne.
been quite good, but I can't remember them.
He did a dinner, an annual press gallery dinner, in which he made a really sort of quite a joke about John Whittingdale, I remember. He was very funny. I don't know if you were at that one. But, they are. I mean,
sounds like a joke that we can't repeat. I would ask him what it was, but I don't think it's a good idea. We're not going there.
But the pressure, it's like sort of doing Have I Got News for You? You have to, come up with... And also you have to sort of do jokes where they're quite edgy, like you sort of slag off your own side. You can't just do a sort of attack. You've got to do something a bit kind of risky, and they are highly, highly stressful.
I should say, though, because she probably won't say herself, but you have got an excellent track record in funny jokes for politicians, right? That's what you were kind of known for.
I did try. I mean, sometimes they crashed and burned. Sometimes the delivery got mangled up in the delivery, but I mean, we would put in about as much. Rupert's absolutely. I mean, in fact, I remember one time Ed Miliband they had a correspondence dinner at Westminster. It was tried to ape the White House correspondence dinner, but everyone had worse teeth in Britain, obviously. And because Ed Miliband was like, I think the bacon sandwich incident had happened not that long before. So the idea of having to have like a 5-course meal in front of the entire lobby, it was very stressful, I have to say.
I was chairman of the press gallery back in 1998, and the first one that year was William Hague. Now, some politicians, I mean, some of them don't want to have any alcohol. I remember I said to William beforehand, "Do you like a drink, William?" "Oh, I'll have a beer." And then when the meal came, "Do you like some wine?" "Oh, I'll have some wine." And the other thing he said to me, when he was bringing in one member, one vote in the Tory party, and I said to him, "We've had one member, one vote in the press gallery for a long time." "Aye, one candidate, one vote, you mean?" Talking about the rigged elections. I remember Peter Mandelson demanding chamomile tea instead of coffee. I also remember one of the first people...
That's a great one, that one. Sorry, that is the most Peter Mandel thing I've ever seen.
I remember...
It's like the mushy peas and the guacamole.
I remember taking the young Tony Blair in the early 80s, and it was trout on the menu, and it was on the bone. And all the hacks were struggling with trout on the bone. Tony Blair... brilliant. And I thought, that's a fetter's education for you.
I love that. That is great. That is very, very good indeed.
Actually, a really good one I went to recently was Theresa May. She actually did a really funny speech. And again, nobody was expecting it. And she was quite acerbic. But she managed to get the delivery out okay.
Right. Yeah, I guess that was the thing as well. As a sort of speech writer or, you know, kind of someone who sort of preps these things, you can give them the material, but you've got no control over what then happens with it,
The comedian Roy Hutt, who used to do jokes, you may know this, for the Labour Party, said that John Prescott was much better at delivering his jokes than Tony Blair.
That is very interesting.
I mean, John Prescott used to have that Les Dawson routine at the end of the Labour Party conference, didn't he?
John, I could listen to your anecdotes all day. When are you going to get... Are you going to write a book or do a podcast series or something?
Well, I do podcasts for Sky News, of course. And... I have started the Craig memoirs.
Have you?
Well, I've not got very far.
This is a good exclusive.
Who's going to play you in the movie?
Breaking
news. Young John Craig.
Yeah.
What, got the Craig memoirs?
Yeah, I mean, going back to my 15 years on, the Boulevard of Broken Dreams, Fleet Street, 4 national newspapers, and some great times at Sky News, of course, as well.
Yeah, as long as you're nice to us, not then we're okay. That's all right.
You especially. Right. Queen of the Dawn. When Sophie first came to Sky News, she did the early morning shifts, the Queen of the Dawn.
Oh, it was a brutal alarm clock, I have to say. Thanks very much, John. Great to have you. And lovely to have you both on the Politics Hub this evening as well. Thanks very much for your time. It's been a big week. So much coming out from the States, as always, but of course, the fallout too from the spring statement. That's 8 from us tonight. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee, and then, of course, at 9 p.m, you've got The World with Yada Hakeem. I'll see you on Monday.